Mayong buntag, it is Friday, May 8. You are watching Rappler and I am at the International Media Center at the Mactan World Museum in Lapu-Lapu City in Cebu Province, where we are covering the 48th ASEAN Summit and other related meetings. My name is Cupin. Earlier in the day, at around 9 a.m., officially nag-kick off na yung 48th ASEAN Summit with all, at least 10 ASEAN member state leaders converging at the Mactan Expo. That's a building just a stone's throw away from where we are, to kick off the summit. This is the first leaders level meeting within ASEAN for 2026, and with the Philippines as chairperson of the bloc. Earlier, or for a month or so, Philippine officials have been emphasizing that this summit will be a bare bones one. During the preparatory meetings also for ASEAN yesterday, here in Cebu, binanggit several times ng Philippine Foreign Minister Maria Teresa Lazaro na magiging austere yung summit na ito in response to a crisis that has affected not just the Philippines, of course, but the whole of ASEAN and arguably the whole of Asia. So in many ways, the Philippines' chairmanship of ASEAN has had to be scaled down. So aside from the summit being bare bones, quote-unquote, in the words of Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. himself, lahat ng ibang meetings related to ASEAN na hindi summit, with the exception of some ministerial level meetings, or at least some meetings within ASEAN, are all online. So itong mga in-person meetings this year, until further notice, will be rare and far apart, this one being the biggest, of course, in 2026 thus far. Understandably, the 48th ASEAN Summit will therefore focus on the Middle East, the effects of the war in the Middle East, economically, in terms of geopolitical considerations, and in the safety of ASEAN nationals, not just in the Middle East but also in Southeast Asia. So tatlong topics or tatlong issues yung nakatutok yung ASEAN leaders as directed by the chair, the Philippines. So first is energy supply and prices, and how volatile it is given geopolitical disruptions in other parts of the world. Second would be food security, because of course food production is heavily reliant on fertilizer, which are petroleum products, or products derived from petroleum. And finally, the safety of ASEAN or Southeast Asian nationals across the world. Sabi ni President Marcos kanina to open the summit, well, first he thanked fellow leaders for recognizing the urgency of this meeting. If you recall, in March, just days after declaring a state of national emergency in the Philippines, Marcos announced na yun nga, magkakaroon ng bare bones, matutuloy, pero bare bones na ang ASEAN Summit here in Cebu. Days after that, in-announce ng Malacanang through the National Organizing Committee of ASEAN that, again, yung ibang meetings related to ASEAN will be held online, or some of them will be in person, pero very selective yun, kumbaga, at parang special circumstances yung i-consider to allow them to be held online. So President Marcos took lengths to emphasize the urgency of this meeting right now in Cebu. So mangyayari today, dalawa yung sessions ng ASEAN leaders. 10 ASEAN leaders and a representative from Myanmar will be speaking or will be meeting here in Cebu. Yung nangyari na or ang ongoing, tapos na siguro na nagla-lunch break na ata sila, ay yung the 48th ASEAN Summit Plenary. This is the more formal meeting between the leaders of ASEAN. They are expected to think about ways moving forward. And by that we mean how the bloc can better protect itself from, again, the volatilities caused by geopolitical tensions, not just specific to the Middle East but in other parts of the world. At sanga-sanga na rin doon yung food security, yung safety of ASEAN nationals. Ang sabi ni President Marcos kanina to open the plenary session, it's a defining moment in our shared journey, referring, of course, to ASEAN. He also emphasized that the bloc should be studying the adjustments that they've made individually as countries in Southeast Asia in response to the crisis in the Middle East. There has been a lot of emphasis on the importance of agility in Southeast Asia. That's a tall order for a bloc that operates on consensus. Therefore, kung may isang ayaw, hindi gagalaw yung ASEAN. Pero over and over again, and this is frankly not new naman, or this is not unique to the Cebu Summit, but in every summit in ASEAN, the focus will, or emphasis will always be placed on centrality. Kumbaga, what does that mean? When you think about you think about your national interests, but you also consider the interest of ASEAN as a whole. The idea being together, this bloc, where a lot of potential is seen. There's a graphic inside the International Media Center that by 2030, ASEAN is expected to be the fourth largest economy in the world collectively, no? So the idea, the thought process behind here is that if the ASEAN member states work together, cooperate together in terms of, again, adjusting to the shocks caused by events elsewhere in the world, they can better, or they can easier achieve those goals of the world's biggest economy. So ang sabi ni President Marcos kanina, difficult times do not divide us. Again, that's a tall order for a bloc that operates solely on consensus and non-interference. Understandably, because this is so focused on the issues in the Middle East, or response to the Middle East crisis, there are a lot of issues that won't be discussed specifically in the plenary and retreat sessions of the leaders' meetings. However, parang na-touch on din siya kahapon, just a quick summary yesterday. During the foreign ministers' meeting, Philippine Foreign Secretary Maria Teresa Lazaro did talk about Myanmar, in that she would report to her counterparts any progress or observations thereof in her role as the special envoy of the ASEAN chairperson to Myanmar. Kahapon din, President Marcos convened a trilateral meeting between the prime ministers of Cambodia and Thailand to talk about the ceasefire, or at least ensuring that a ceasefire is maintained after months last year, at least, of clashes over their border dispute. Now, the question is, after the two meetings today, the plenary and the retreat sessions, will ASEAN leaders, foreign ministers, economic ministers, and the ministers who are under the socio-cultural cluster or community of ASEAN, will they be able to come up with concrete and actionable solutions to help and future-proof a region that has shown to be so vulnerable to shocks in another part of the world, in the Middle East? If you live in the Philippines, and frankly, if you live in Southeast Asia, you would be very well aware of the real-life effects of the shocks, or at least the volatility of the situation in the Middle East. This is translated for a lot of Filipinos, a lot of Southeast Asians, a sharp rise in oil, gas, diesel, the prices of petroleum products in the Philippines, because the Philippines, most of all, is very reliant on crude oil and petroleum products from the Middle East. Other parts of, or other members of ASEAN, different na yung dependence nila on Middle East, on the access to Middle East oil. Of course, another thing there is, of course, food security, and also for the Philippines, a major issue would be the safety of migrant workers elsewhere. So it's only 11:30 in the morning on May 8th. Leaders are having their lunch right now, and then later on magkakaroon ng retreat, a more informal gathering where leaders are expected to exchange notes, kumbaga, reflect on how they've responded to the crisis so far, and perhaps built into that, learn from each other and see what would apply to other countries as well, even as the members of ASEAN try to respond to the crisis ahead. Later on in the day at 4 p.m., Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, as chair of ASEAN, is expected to brief the media on the results of the summit. May outcome document na ine-expect ang ASEAN, or at least Philippines as chairperson, from this summit. This will basically be the position of ASEAN on the Middle East. If you recall, nagkaroon na ng position through the foreign ministers, but kumbaga yung highest level na position, or yung official position ng ASEAN, can only come from a leaders meeting, the first of which is happening today in Cebu. So if you want more updates of ASEAN in Cebu, and if you have to better understand ano bang consequences ng summit na ito, ng discussions na ito, on your lives, on the lives of Southeast Asians in the region and beyond, you can follow Rappler. We have a live updates page. We also have analysis pieces there, and summaries and wraps related to the meetings that were held earlier and the summits that are being held today. There's also, if you want to discuss ASEAN perhaps, a critique of how slow it can move, when it wants to move very slow. You can also download the Rappler app and talk to us at the security and global affairs chat or community group. I'm there, and my colleagues are also there. You can exchange views over there. We will be in Cebu until the end of the day to cover the 48th ASEAN Summit. Tonight we'll be talking to you again to give you a wrap of the outcomes of the meetings here in Cebu today, including President Marcos's press conference. Again, this is Cupin. You have been watching Rappler. Thank you for tuning in.